Hello there, it's Gene Tunney here for the Economics Explored live show. It's Friday morning, 21st of January 2022 here in Brisbane, Australia. I'm coming to you from the Adept Economics offices at the Johnson Hotel in Spring Hill, Brisbane. And it's great to be chatting with you about the big economic issues of the week. So what I'd like to speak with you about today are what I see as the big issues, the things that I've been paying attention to for various reasons, and they include the UK CPI inflation number coming in at its highest rate since 1992, so we'll have a look at that. So that's 30 years ago now. So I was in high school, and that was an interesting time. And who would have thought how the world would have evolved since then? The Cold War had ended, and we all thought it was the end of history and things were going to be great, but hasn't turned out to be the case. Anyway, that's one of the stories. The next story is about the German 10-year bond yield, which turned positive at least for a day. So we'll have a look at that. That's something quite interesting. And then the Australian labour force data that were published by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, yesterday, which confirmed how strong the economy was prior to this Omicron outbreak that we're going through at the moment, and which is causing what some say is a shadow lockdown or a pseudo lockdown, and that's constraining people's movement and activity and spending. So we will have a chat about that. But first, let's have a look at the UK inflation data. Okay, so I put that up on the screen, and you'll see that through the year to December, that UK inflation number has come in at 5.4%, so highest in 30 years, as I mentioned. And their core inflation, so if you strip out some of those volatile items, such as food and energy, then you end up with inflation at over 4%. So their core measure is relatively high too. And now there's talk about, well, what does that mean for the Bank of England, and what does that mean for interest rates in the UK? And the Financial Times reported the other day that the Bank of England faces a dilemma. So it failed to anticipate that surge in inflation, and it's under pressure to increase interest rates to cool spending and bring inflation down to that 2% target. The challenge it faces, of course, is that it wants to make sure that the economy recovers from the weakness during the pandemic. So it doesn't want to risk a downturn or slower growth in the future if it increases interest rates too fast. So that's what the challenge there is. Now, having said that, so they do. It looks like they have more than just a transitory problem that will go away. So it looks like some policy action is required, because this is feeding into wages, and that's one of the concerns they have. So wages are increasing. So we had wage growth at 3.8% at an annual rate in the 3 months to November, and this is related to what's been a very tight labour market in the UK, and unemployment's down around 4.1%. So they've got a similar issue to that in the US, and also we've got low unemployment here. we haven't seen the growth in wages to the extent that they have in those countries. In the US, Larry Summers has said they've got a massively overheating labour market. Now, I mean, maybe we'll see that in Australia. Well, let's wait and see. But certainly in the UK, they've got that issue at the moment. So they recognise that they've got an inflation problem, they've got wages growth, but at the same time, they're concerned that if they increase interest rates too quickly, then that could risk the economic recovery. So it's a fine balancing act for them. Okay, so that's the UK inflation. Incidentally, the Australian CPI number will be coming out next week on Tuesday. So we'll see what's happening in Australia. We know that in other countries, inflation has been accelerating. It has started to pick up here in Australia, but it hasn't got up to the rates that we've seen in, say, the US. I should have left that back up. So let's have a look. I've got the US number, and that came out the other week, and that's getting up. Was that up around 7% or so for their headline measure? And then if you take out food and energy, it's over 5%. So they've got accelerating inflation there in the US too. We will start to see that here in Australia. So Stephen Kirchner, on his Substack blog earlier this week, he wrote that next week's December quarter CPI should show another strong print. Dusting off my models for both trimmed mean and weighted median yields, an estimate of 0.8% quarter on quarter and 2.4% year on year for both. So higher inflation here in Australia. Kirchner, interestingly, he doesn't think this is as much of a problem as some other people do. He thinks it's driven by a global, well, it's not that he doesn't think it's a problem, he doesn't think interest rates should be increased to deal with it because he thinks it's a supply side shock. So he doesn't think it's going to feed into wages, and then we have this expectation of higher inflation, and then this inflationary spiral. So that's an interesting perspective. If you don't subscribe to Stephen's blog on his Substack, then check it out. Stephen's always got interesting things to say. Okay, so that's what's happening in the UK and US. Another country that's had high inflation is Germany. So inflation there is over 5%. And one of the interesting bits of economic news earlier this week is that for one day on Wednesday, the German 10-year bond yield was trading above 0%. So Germany is one of these countries that's had negative interest rates, and it's had a negative yield on its 10-year government bond since about, early 2019. The first half of 2019, if I'm looking at that chart correctly. And so there was a bit of excitement when that got above 0% on Wednesday. Now, when I had a look at the bond yield estimate for Germany just before on Google, it looks like it's gone slightly below zero. I mean, we're talking just a smidge below zero. So when it went positive, it got up to, what was it? It got to as high as 0.013%. So not even 0.1%. But look, that got a few people excited because, it could be a reflection of expectations of higher inflation and interest rates in the future. But it's still a very low 10-year bond rate, obviously. So we're not seeing expectations of high inflation and interest rates in Germany well, the markets aren't seeing that. So anyway, negative interest rates are a fascinating subject, and one I think we might come back to in a future conversation, just to go through them, what they mean, should we be worried about them, all of those type of questions. It's probably a bit too much to go into today. So that was something I thought was quite fascinating. Now, the other big bit of news, and particularly for us here in Australia, the data on the labour force that comes out from the ABS. So every month, so their December labour force data came out, and they just confirmed what we already knew, that prior to this Omicron outbreak, that really it just took off in just before Christmas and then into January, and suddenly, in Queensland here where I am, we had practically no cases, and then suddenly we're getting, it sort of started with 6 cases, and it crept up to 80 or whatever, a few hundred. Next thing, 3,000, and then a week later over 10,000, and almost 16, 17,000. Actually, we probably had over 22,000 one day, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, big shock to people in Queensland. So we're still sort of working out. Well, and across Australia, you've had tens of thousands of cases in southern states too, even higher numbers, obviously. Still trying to work out what all that means. But in December, things were looking really good, and I've talked about on this live stream and on my blog, Queensland Economy Watch, my local economics blog, I've talked about how those leading indicators for Australia and for Queensland were looking really good. High job vacancies, and various other indicators of building approvals, particularly for residential building. And then we've had, there's a bit of an infrastructure pipeline, not as big as it has been in the past, but we had really encouraging indicators. Unfortunately, we've had this Omicron outbreak. So what we got yesterday, data showing that the unemployment rate in Australia's got down to 4.2%. Queensland's a bit higher than that at 4.7%. WA is doing extraordinarily well, below 3.5% now. WA, of course, has been Fortress WA and isn't letting anyone else into the state unless you do your hotel quarantine. And it was just announced last night that they're going to be delaying their reopening to the rest of Australia because of this Omicron outbreak. They don't want to have this get into their state and get out of control. That's an interesting decision. How long can you live cut off from the rest of Australia? That's a big call from the Premier of WA. But not being there, I won't pass judgment on that decision. Okay. So that's the unemployment rate. And there was data on employment too. My logo's obscuring WA being nearly 5% up on its employment level in March 2020. Queensland's over 4% up, and Australia's nearly 2% up. So we have had that, well, at least up until this Omicron outbreak, we had this strong rebound in the Australian economy and labour market. Okay. But since then, these data relate to what was happening early in the first half of December. But since then, we've had the Omicron outbreak, which is meaning that people just aren't moving around. And we've seen various bits of real-time data or high-frequency data. We've seen the Google mobility data, which shows just how much, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne and in New South Wales, we've had a big drop in mobility for retail and recreation purposes, so 20% down. in Queensland, it looks like it's around 6% down. That's up to 17 January, so that's up to Monday, this Monday past. And one thing we've got to bear in mind is that these aren't seasonally adjusted data. And at this time, when I look back at the data for January last year, it looks like activity's down anyway, or people aren't moving around as much anyway. So it's difficult to know how much to panic over this. I've got to do a fuller analysis of this. But certainly, so what we know is Queensland, the pseudo lockdown or the shadow lockdown is not as bad as in New South Wales and Victoria, which makes sense because the case numbers there are much higher and they're much denser cities, Sydney and Melbourne, than Brisbane. So maybe people are more, they're not as reluctant or scared to move around. I mean, there's certainly been an impact, particularly in the CBDs. We've seen that not as many people are going into the CBDs. And if you want to check that out, have a look at the Google mobility reports, which you can find on the net, and you'll see for Brisbane City particularly, so retail and recreation, that's down 17% compared to baseline, what they call baseline, and that compares with, 6% down statewide. So Brisbane City's really been badly affected, and public transport 60%, nearly 60% down. Well, yeah, no one wants to catch the train or the bus during the Omicron wave, unless you absolutely have to. So that's understandable. Okay, so that's what we're going through at the moment. Who knows how long this will last? I mean, I've heard talk of 6 weeks, and there's hope that this will all be over in early February. That hopefully we've already peaked and we're coming down. Look, I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't know. It really does need to improve quickly, or that really is going to compromise our economic performance this quarter. I mean, it's certainly going to detract from the performance this quarter. I mean, if it goes on longer, I mean, who knows? We could have a negative quarter. I don't think anyone's in a position yet to forecast what the impact on quarterly economic growth would be. We are starting to see it impact on, spending. ANZ Research released some data the other week that shows it's had a big hit to dining spending on restaurants and cafes in Sydney and Melbourne. Can't remember the number offhand. Off the top of my head, it might have been 20% or so. We're seeing a hit to consumer confidence, so it is starting to impact. Let's just hope it is resolved quickly, or it's going to be. Things could get difficult, and I mean, they're going to be increasing calls for government assistance. I saw Brisbane City Council, it's providing a small amount of assistance to some businesses in Brisbane. We'll see more calls for that across the country. I mean, just wait and see what happens. Right, so that's consumer confidence that we just looked at. And I think that's the end of my slides. I'll just take that off. And I think the final thing to talk about today is what's been called this supply chain crisis, which is, potentially very worrying. So the Courier Mail this morning reported that power could be out for weeks, meat supplies scarce for months, and supermarket shelves will remain empty as the state's major industries face potentially disastrous staff shortages with no rapid antigen tests in sight. So this is for Queensland. I think there are similar issues in other states of Australia. Queensland's industry union leaders say the state's meat supply, transport and power systems are currently hanging on by a thread, and unless they can be supplied with millions of rapid antigen tests, they face critical staff shortages which could temporarily shut down Queensland's basic supply chain. Okay, so that doesn't sound good, does it? Right, so how do we interpret this? So a couple of things that come to mind. One, I mean, we need to recognise the media is going to sensationalise things. That's That's for sure. I mean, okay, look, the facts on the ground aren't great. You as well as I would have noticed. I mean, if you're in Australia here and probably in other countries too, you go into the supermarkets, you can't get the full range of products that you once would have. So, we're certainly seeing some impacts. That said, I mean, there's still groceries available at the Woolies that I go to at Spring Hill. So it's not quite the end of the world yet. Okay, so we recognise there's some sensationalisation by the media, some beating up of stories, as they say. And the second point I'd make is that we should trust, or we should have some faith that our industries, that our private sector will resolve these issues in time. That we should have faith in that basic market mechanism, so long as it's not restricted by onerous regulations. And I think this has been part of the problem. We've had these rules around close contacts, or, well, obviously if you get COVID, you shouldn't be going to work. But then there's the issue, well, when do you go to work after you've had COVID? And how do you know if you can go, if you can't have a rapid antigen test that clears you? So that there's that sort of issue. If you're a close contact of someone with COVID, how do you know if you can go to work if you can't get these rapid antigen tests? So there's those sorts of issues. Thankfully, we had these isolation requirements which were causing problems, because if you were a close contact of someone with COVID, the government was saying, well, you have to isolate for 7 days or whatever it was, and you should only go out if you get a rapid antigen test that says you're negative or something like that. So we've had these rules that have made it very difficult for people to go to work. They've recently relaxed those for essential workers. So if you are in an essential industry, so if you're in the meat industry, if you're in, I think, retail, if you're in supermarkets, that sort of thing. So they've got categories of essential workers, and that's meant to alleviate this issue to some extent. So, I mean, that's good news. I mean, governments are obviously, I mean, they're worried about this. I mean, it's not good for a government if people can't get meat and other groceries, and I mean, that's the sort of thing that leads to governments collapsing, really, if you think about it. I mean, think about what happened in the Soviet Union when people couldn't get bread and all the other supermarket goods. So, government's obviously very conscious of that. Now, other than the government, one group that could cause problems and stop the market from sorting this out is the lawyers. And I must say, I was disappointed to see this story on the ABC News yesterday. They reported that essential workers can now be on the job despite COVID-19 exposure. So this is what I'm talking about, this relaxation. If you're an essential worker, you can go. Well, I think as long as you don't have symptoms, you can go on the job. But if you have been a close contact, technically you just have to go to the job, do the job, then go back home. So it's not complete freedom, but it provides some relief for the supply chain. Okay, back to that story, which I found disturbing. Essential workers can now be on the job despite COVID-19 exposure. So what are the risks? And what I found very disturbing was this statement here. Legal experts say businesses that let essential workers onto the job just after they have been exposed to COVID-19 may be opening themselves up to being sued. So, I mean, come on. I mean, this is lawyers chasing, not quite chasing maybe chasing ambulances in some cases, but definitely chasing fees. And, I mean, let's hope that courts recognise the necessity of essential workers going to work if lawsuits do occur. And let's hope that courts take a very, I'd say it's enlightened. I'd say it's an an attitude of, well, look, these people do need to work. We need the economy to keep running. That's important. We need people to be fed, to make sure they can get groceries. So, look, I really hope that is we don't see legal action over this. And it just reminded me of that great joke in Philadelphia, the Tom Hanks Academy Award winning film from the mid-90s, where the joke was, what do you call 1,000 lawyers chained together at the bottom of the ocean? A good start. So, yeah. So lawyers could still cause some trouble. Let's hope not. Righto, that's my wrap-up of the big economic news of the week. So please send questions, comments to contact@economicsexplored.com. I'd love to hear your thoughts to my reactions to these news items. Some of these reactions are really immediate. They're my first reactions. It's often hard to do the detailed analysis of a lot of these developments. But so yes, if you've got your own views, then please let me know. Very interested in hearing from you. Next week, we'll have a look at the Australian CPI, whatever other economic news comes up that week. And I must say, let's hope we're not talking about the economic impacts of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, which, that is certainly looking like it is a possibility in the future, if not the whole of the country, then part of the country. And there's been a lot of media criticism of President Biden because he essentially acknowledged that could occur. I mean, maybe he's just acknowledging reality. I don't know. So we'll have to see what happens there and what that means for oil and gas prices. I mean, that's another potential big risk to the global economy in 2022. Okay, thanks for your time this morning if you're in Australia. Thanks for in your evening if you're in the States. If you're in the UK at the moment, you're probably sleeping, so I'm not chatting with you. Thanks for your time. Looking forward to catching up with you again soon. Thank you.